Welcome to Chess with Link. Today we're talking about taking advantage of your opponent's exposed king. Now this is going to help us recognize some really essential patterns for both how the king moves around the board and how we can threaten multiple pieces at the same time using a variety of configurations. In this first puzzle that we look at, the first of 5, you're going to notice that pawns and rooks are essential. Especially because all our opponent would need to do is capture our pawn at h4 to put us in check. And, well, that's not immediately checkmate. It's pretty scary as we're forced to move our king to g1. And then our opponent still has another rook sitting over here on a3. So we really don't want that to happen. But let's think a little bit more about that h4 pawn. It's blocked. It can't go any further on its own, so we might be tempted to just ignore it. But notice that it's guarding g5. It's always important to remember that even if a pawn is not allowed to advance, it can still be guarding squares to the diagonal. Are you getting any ideas yet? Here's another clue. You see those rooks that we have in the F file? 2 of them. We have a battery. We have linked rooks in the F file, and that means that our opponent cannot move their king into the F file, whether just to move or to capture. Both options are blocked by us having a rook in the F file and it being guarded. And that means that if we don't want our opponent to have a turn in which they could check us, we could bully our opponent's king a little bit. We can push our rook up to f8 here, and that will force our opponent to move. Now, he could have gone to g7, but that would have been just as stuck. So at least here at h7, he has a chance of going and hiding behind his own pawns. But remember that that space is limited. Have you seen how to take advantage of that? Now, we have 2 rooks in the F file. We don't have to worry as much about them protecting each other right now. But the king did just move to a place that gets him close to a pocket we could attack. So let's move our rearward rook up to f7. And this is important. We're using the rook that previously was just guarding, both so that the king can't just jump up to h8 if we had moved our 8th rank rook, and because now the f7 rook not only is forcing the king down to h6, but it is denying him access to the entire 7th rank, meaning that he now cannot go up above that line, which means he can't escape up that line, which means that we can now break the protection of the rooks on each other and take our f8 rook over to h8 to check the king. He can't get revenge like he could if we used the 7th rank rook, and he won't be able to run away because of the pawn guarding g5. So rook to h8 is a bit of a surprising checkmate. Using linked rooks and paying attention to our pawns, even the pawn that is blocked, allows us to turn a potentially dangerous situation into a checkmate in merely 3 turns. Now for this next puzzle, we don't have rooks. In fact, we only have a bishop and a knight, and oh my goodness, bishop, knight, pawn endgame is tough. And if we lose all of our pawns and just have a king and a knight or a king and a bishop, it's an automatic stalemate at best. We cannot win with just a king and a knight or a king and a bishop, and it requires our opponent making a mistake for us to win with the king, the bishop, and the knight. So ultimately, this puzzle comes down to we need to get rid of our opponent's rook. Because that rook is the most dangerous thing for our pawns. And we've got to promote a pawn if we want to have a victory that doesn't involve hoping our opponent makes a mistake. Okay, how do we do this? Well, we can't take the rook immediately because it is guarded by a knight. Okay, so if we cannot capture the rook right away, how could we engineer a situation that would allow us to take that rook? Well, there's a tiny bit of hope in that our knight could check the king on e4 while threatening the rook at the same time. It's a fork. Now, these can be hard to find. They really can be. In this particular configuration especially, when the king and the rook are not in the same rank or file, we have to pay attention to how they are both an L away from a particular square. How do we do that? Conveniently, we can count squares. If the king is 1, 2, 3 steps away from a rook, look to see if there's somewhere your knight can attack it that is also going to threaten the rook. So let's try that. Knight checks the king. The king takes our pawn. That is a little bit concerning. But now we can take the rook with our knight. And here's the part that I really enjoy about this particular puzzle. Besides the fact that we have practiced noticing that if a king and another piece are 3 squares apart, basically an extra long knight jump apart, then we can get a fork. But here's another important part to remember when you're getting to fighting an exposed king in endgame. If you check a king with a knight, either the king must be moved or the knight must be captured. And in this case, our opponent does capture our knight, but c5 is now no longer guarded by a rook or a knight. So our king can get engaged and take that knight. Now, I mentioned that it's impossible to win with just a king and a bishop. But conveniently, our bishop is going to make it a little bit harder for that king to approach our king and pawns, so we will have time to nudge our king over and use it to help repel our opponent's king and pawns as we get a promotion. At which point, this becomes a pretty easy victory. We've talked about attacking with rooks. We've talked about attacking with knights. We have a similar configuration here, except it's perhaps even more dire. We have fewer pawns, our opponent has a queen, and they're getting ready to promote a pawn over there on h4. 3 more turns, and that pawn gets advanced. Sure, we could capture the pawn with our bishop, but then we would immediately lose our bishop, and that gives me a thought, though. The king and the queen, how far apart are they? Could we threaten them both with the knight? Not quite. They are 1, 2, 3, 4 squares apart from each other instead of 3 squares apart from each other. But that's only if they're in different ranks or files. What if we attracted the queen to h4 by sacrificing our bishop? Would that work? Oh no! Our knight would not be able to reach the queen or the king. Why am I going down this rabbit hole then? Is there any way we could force the king onto h7 or g8, since attracting the queen to h4 is not going to save us? Could we get the king either 1, 2, 3 squares away, just like in the previous few puzzles, or 1, 2, 3 squares away, but in the same rank or file? Remember, just because we're being attracted over here, just because we are looking at that h4 pawn because it's a menace and guarded by the queen, doesn't mean we have to go that direction with our bishop. If we take our bishop to c3, that puts the king in check. And then he must move because the queen cannot get in the way. Let's bring the bishop to c3. And now there are 3 spaces between the king and the queen while they're in the same rank or file. And we can move our knight to f6 to threaten both of them at the same time. Because the king must move or the checking piece must be taken. A knight cannot be blocked. The king moves. And then we get to take the queen. We're then blocking the g6 pawn, and the h4 pawn is going to have to step into a threatened square in order to promote, at which point the knight will be able to capture it. And once again, this is going to be a bit of a challenging endgame. We will have to get a pawn promoted or move with absolute precision with our king and remaining pieces. But it's going to be a lot easier now that we've simplified that queen off of the board. All right, we've looked at a few configurations. We've been attacking an exposed king so far using rooks, knights, and bishops. But this time, the exposed king doesn't have a queen that we can fork. It doesn't have a pawn that it's going to be stuck behind. And for that matter, we have to be cautious because if our opponent takes our rook on b6, nothing is guarding that rook, and then they can easily step down to b8 to put us in check. Now that's not going to be a checkmate, but only because they don't yet have a bishop capable of getting over here to h7. But the h5 pawn is guarding g6, keeping our king from getting out of that pocket. Any way that we could simplify this board? Perhaps getting rid of multiple threatening pieces. And maybe even ending up with an advantage pieces. We could check the king. If we check at f3 or h1, the king will have to move because nothing can get in the way. And if the king, let's say we checked at h1 and then the king moved to g2, f2, or e2, well, then we could take the rook, but then we would lose our rook. And we've gained a little bit of material, but does that give you any ideas? We're still worried about losing the rook in the b file. But if we have a plan to get rid of the d rook, and we already have kind of given up on our rook in the b file, What if we sacrifice our rook in the b file to get rid of the b1 rook? It doesn't compel a move, but the d rook does not have access to our back row, and going to either side does not let him threaten any of our pieces, except capturing back in revenge for us taking the b rook. So if we capture on b1, our opponent will almost certainly capture back, because otherwise we're just going to capture their rook and put them in check, and then we're one turn from checkmate, and now our skewer works, because now we can move our rook from h3 to h1, which forces the king to move. And then we can take his sole remaining rook. It requires a sacrifice. And paying attention to which pieces we know we're probably going to lose anyway, as well as a skewer that we could set up if we had a slightly better situation. And combining those two ideas into a simplification that, while not a guaranteed win, is certainly better than we were at just 3 turns ago. Let's think about how we could combine a lot of these things we've talked about. Could we get a fork? Could we force the king to move? Could we get a really strong simplification that might not immediately win the game, but will absolutely give us an advantage? Well, the queen is sitting on a dark square, and we don't have a dark square bishop. And our queen is blocked in by our own knight. So we don't really have a way of directly hitting the queen herself, other than maybe putting our knight on f7, because that is only guarded by the king, but we don't have anything else guarding f7. And it's not a fork yet, because the king and queen are 2 squares apart from each other in the same rank. If they were 2 squares apart from each other and in different ranks, 3 steps away, then our knight would be able to threaten. But that's a lot of imagining. We need a simpler piece of imagination. Well, if our knight was on f7, which is currently only threatened by the king, and our pawn was guarding f7, the king would be forced to move closer to the knight because we'd already be guarding h8. So it would let us take the queen, but what would happen along the way? There's a lot of possibilities. What if we fight our opponent for control of the center a little bit, though? Let's go ahead and try to get into a configuration where we have a little bit more power in the center. Perhaps a bishop that could help us out, since there is only a pawn between the bishop and the king. What if our knight captures on d5? We lose it to our opponent's pawn. But then we could take that pawn. Our opponent might move to f8. And if they move to f8, we're going to check them at g6. And then they're going to be pretty well trapped. They won't have a lot of move options at all, except maybe back to f7, at which point they've lost so much tempo. So let's see what happens. We take our bishop to d5. Our opponent goes to h7 because they know that they're going to be in a lot of trouble otherwise. But remember that there's a pawn. It's easy to forget about those pawns, isn't it? So if we move our pawn up to g6, our opponent knows not to move their king back to h8 or they're going to get forked. But remember, finding those knight forks involves really counting squares and really practicing thinking like an angry octopus. We move our knight up to f7. The king is forced to move. We both have opened up the e-file now, which is a little bit risky, but we've got rooks guarding each other down there at e1 and f1. And because the king was forced to move again, we get to take the queen. And even if our opponent takes back with their rook, now we completely own the e-file and can race our own rook up there to check again, leading into a path that may well turn to checkmate pretty fast. Now, folks, all of these puzzles we've just gone through involved looking for ways to push the king around the board and find a continuation, especially find a fork or a skewer. Now, finding forks and skewers, that's its entirely own video, and we will continue to practice those together for probably as long as I'm playing chess. But if you pay attention to kind of the order of operations, the tempo of the game, the forcing your opponent to move to a square so that you can then take the next move, and really start practicing your board vision, really start practicing looking at how far apart those pieces are, and if you can hit with a knight, where could you push the king that you could also hit? If you can threaten the king with a bishop or a rook, what's on the other side of the king? Practicing that and keeping your own king from being exposed are powerful tools to help you advance your middle game or secure your end game.